What is up, everybody? It's New Year. It's 2023, and this is RotoBrady Grove, bringing you Roto Bowler's official MMA podcast. Tap that. This is the first episode of 2023. I'm trying to get as many guests in here as possible while the UFC is taking time. It feels like it's already like a couple weeks into January, and it's not. We still have time before the UFC's back. With me today, this is another very special interlude episode of Tap That. He is the host of the MMA Gambling Podcast on the Sports Gambling Podcast Network. It is Daniel Gumby Vreeland back here for the second time. Daniel, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on again, man.
Yeah, so let's start off with this. I want to reflect more on 2022 a little later, because a year in MMA goes by so fast that I just tried to look today at like what are considered to be the best fights and knockouts of 2022. And I cannot believe that some of that stuff happened all in the same year. But to cap off the year, Bellator versus Ryzen, and it did not rise above my expectations, Daniel. Based on your episode this week, I have a feeling you feel pretty similar.
Yeah, and it for a couple of reasons too. Obviously, the Bellator versus Ryzen part of that fight card was a little lackluster, right? We wound up with 5 decisions. 2 of them were kind of close, and for the most part, it was just like it feels like the Ryzen guy kind of couldn't get out of their own way, right? Especially with the Pitbull fight. The Pitbull fight, you know, I felt like if Herbst just put the foot on the gas a little bit more, like he probably could have beat Pitbull, and that also felt kind of yucky because I was like, I don't know, Pitbull seems like he's 80 times better than that dude, unless they're grappling, of course, right? Like Herbst is a pretty good grappler, so. The fights themselves, I was like, it's just kind of like lackluster, one-sided decision after lackluster, one-sided decision. And, you know, if you got up early and you watched the Ryzen 40 card, the Ryzen 40 card was actually sick. There was a nice John Dodson KO in there. Yeah, a whole bunch of other really good stuff on that portion of the card. But the big bummer for me was just that, like, I feel like, I really feel like Bellator dropped the bag here, because you know, like we've talked for so long about cross promotion and how that's probably the next step for MMA, and if they want to be legitimate or somebody wants to challenge the UFC, they've got to like do stuff like this. So when they made this announcement, you know, first of all, Bellator was trying to hype it up. They had, you know, Josh Thompson go on his podcast and say it is the media's job to do extra hype to this. And while I don't believe it's the media's job to hype anything up, I think it's the promoter's job to hype things up. The media actually did step up after that. There was tons of coverage out there, whether you're, you know, on one of the bigger sites or one of the smaller sites. Like you could find stuff on Bellator versus Ryzen, and then they showed it on freaking tape delay. Like,
hate it.
No, like I won't watch anything on tape delay. Like if there's a football game going on that I really wanted to watch, and I get stuck at a wedding, or I get stuck, you know, a christening or something like that, and I can't watch it, I will follow along with the scores. I'm not going to TiVo the game and tell nobody to tell me the answer and then watch it later. Like I'll just catch the results as they come up. Ditto, in the rare chance I have to miss a UFC event, you know, like I've been in, my cousin got married, luckily at the night of Derek Lewis versus Francis Ngannou. So I actually missed that bad boy. And again, caught the results so that I didn't have to, you know, miss my cousin's wedding. And, but I like caught the results as they happen, you know, go take a pee, check and see who won the last fight, maybe catch 30 seconds while you're at the urinal or something like that. Like you can't, sports is like the last frontier of something that can't be streamed after the fact, can't be binged after the fact, at least not for me.
Yeah.
And certainly not 14 hours later, right? Like this was substantially later in the night. You know, that event ended around noontime Eastern, and I think they started airing at 8 p.m. Also on New Year's night. So yeah, for me, a little bit because of the fights, but a lot of it because of how Bellator handled it, especially after hyping it up like that.
Yeah, I can't think of anything I would watch on tape delay. You know, sports is not like just any other entertainment, and especially fighting. It's not like any other entertainment that you can stream on TV. Like I'm not watching a show. I'm watching for the ups and downs. And because you don't know what's going to happen, even though if you don't know what happened in tape delay, you know that it already did happen and you can't unknow that. And it takes a little bit out of it already. I remember I must have been in like 7th or 8th grade. And it was the Nate Marquardt versus Yushin Okami fight night main event. And that was on tape delay. I guess because it was in like Japan or China. I really don't know where Yushin Okami is from, honestly. I think
Japan. He's a Japanese dude. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, it was in Japan, so it was on tape delay. And as a 7th or 8th grade, I don't think I knew that, and I don't think MMA like media was good enough to get that message out to fans. And so like I checked like I don't know whatever the MMA news app like was on my phone at the time, but it was like Nate Marquardt beats Yushin Okami in super lame decision. And I was like, oh, there goes my whole night then. Like
Yeah.
not only that it sucked, I could sit here and pretend. No, I'm not going to sit here and watch number 3 versus number 4, who would never beat number 1 at the time. That it was already, yeah. Tape delay is super lame.
And worse too now versus when you were in 7th grade. Social media is just like a part of the sports world, right? Like whether or not we love the fact that it's a part of the sports world and what parts of social media are, it just emphatically is. You know, whether you're on Facebook or you're on Instagram or you're on Twitter or you're on YouTube, it doesn't matter which social medias you're on. If you're in the MMA sphere, as I am, like I'm just going to see it, or I'm not going to interact with sports all day, because that's how I interact with sports, right? Like I'm interacting with people who listen to my show on Twitter. I'm posting things on Instagram for people to find clips of my show and stuff like that. And like you just don't get that and avoid all of the spoilers. Like there's no way to do it anymore.
No, I hate it. And yeah, me and you were talking about Yoshi Sarita for the other day for like what felt like hours, because the amount of thoughts that I have about that dude and everything that I wish he could be and what that event kind of disappointed me on. But like that's just like you said on your guys' episode this week, like that was just a big game plan mistake. Like what was he doing? The one thing I would not have recommended that he do against Junior Tafa, as much less as we know about Junior as we do about Justin, what we do know about them is that like they like to throw. They're boxers and kickboxers. Tsuyoshi, you're a sumo wrestler. Apparently, those skills have translated very well over so far. But like, don't try to box with this dude, man. This could be a real like marquee win on a marquee night paired with a marquee event for this dude who's a heavyweight former sumo wrestler. That's so marketable. And you know the thing that you said about the Bellator versus Ryzen event, how I've picked a couple of underdogs from Ryzen too, and really going into that event, the only guy that I thought didn't have any chance against his Bellator counterpart was Ugi Kobo. Because we have seen it demonstrated multiple times that Kyoji Horiguchi is head and shoulders above him. And like Kyoji Horiguchi is probably my favorite fighter in Bellator, at least male fighter in Bellator, and he's my favorite dude on this card. But the Ryzen cards are interesting to me because like I like to see the comparison of the top qualities of these organizations. And it's not as clear cut as some people think. And that is saying, like Ryzen, when I think of Ryzen, I think of Manel Kape, because he's everything that I want a star from Ryzen who's working their way somewhere else to be. He's got like the bleach blonde hair. He was doing the Iverson crossover the other day, which was weird. And then like him and Dvorak seemed to be cool after the fight. But like he's kind of flashy. He's exciting. You think all the potential's there. He's marketable. But at the end of the day, he shoots himself in the foot because he can't pull the trigger on some of his offense. If some of these Ryzen guys overall would just let themselves go in some of these fights, Like, Patricio, AJ McKee, Juan Archuleta, I really thought there was a very real chance that all three of those guys could have lost on New Year's Eve. And it's, I don't know. I feel like it didn't do that much for Bellator because it was at 8 p.m. on a New Year's Eve on Showtime on tape delay. And Bellator has this policy where they're only allowed to tell 5 people each that they're having a big event. So if you can be a dedicated fight fan and still miss a Bellator event because they keep it a secret. So it probably didn't do a whole lot for Bellator on New Year's Eve. And Ryzen, I just wish we would have seen, one or two of those dudes at the top of those classes get a win over, Archuleta, Pitbull, not Horiguchi because I love that dude, but McKee. It makes it a lot more interesting, I think, when you can envision a whole tier of like 1A organizations of MMA in the world, as opposed to how it was for so long. There was a first place, and then there was a clear second place after the Pride era, and then there was a huge drop off. But now what I really like is I have a lot of debates in my head about like in what areas Ryzen and Bellator and PFL and one, of course, how they're better than each other in some ways, and the quality of their fighters at the top. And like PFL is absolutely wiping the floor with all of them in terms of like, I think the way that they have sought to carve out a market for themselves in the United States. Now, obviously, that's more of a longer term goal for Ryzen and One, but PFL like immediately became way more famous and recognizable just to a general member of the mass audience than Bellator. And Bellator produces guys, they have since their inception that you look at and no one's paying attention to them, and they're fighting guys that are probably all outside maybe the top 10 or 15 in the world. This is kind of early Bellator, but even watching Ben Askren for a while, it's like, he's super boring, and he wasn't like a douchey character like for another decade yet. But it's like, this guy might be like a top 10, maybe top 5 welterweight in the world. He's just that good of a wrestler. And Eddie Alvarez and Michael Chandler and all the lower weight classes from the lightweights, and as reputable of champions as they have had at welterweight and middleweight, like Lima Mousasi, that is like, those are strong champions no matter what organization the banner's under. And it honestly just like, it just feels like another year of like whatever for Bellator. They put on great fights. They have some of the like most exciting dudes in the world to watch in some of those, feather and lightweight classes. I think it's really interesting how they do their prospects and how they bring guys in to make their pro debut fresh off of winning Division I wrestling championships. And they fight their whole pro career in Bellator. Like Tyrell Fortune and Davian Franklin. Like, that's a real like group of prospects that you can follow, and some that the UFC misses. But at the end, Bellator is just like run by like a bunch of like interns or something, and like lazy ones who aren't even into fighting. They missed Corey Anderson on the belt.
Well, I would say this. So I to an extent agree with you, especially with the cross promotion stuff. Like I think if any of these promotions want to give the UFC any kind of real challenge, doing more of this kind of stuff to show that there is like a second tier, and that second tier is pretty damn good, would give a lot of people notice. And to your point, yeah, like I think each of those promotions would have a little something over the other one. I think you could also throw KSW, which you didn't mention in there too. Like I think KSW has got some really top level dudes in there as well. So like I think for sure that's true. The difference between them all right now, though, is I don't think it's necessarily the way that Bellator runs their promotion, because to some extent they do a really good job. I don't think they do a very good job. You're right, marketing. You get like I remember when the Bellator Dublin event was about to start, and I got like an email being like, "Oh, the press conference begins tonight," and I was like, "That card is this week? Are you kidding me?" And like I'm on their media list, so like I'm on their media list, and I still didn't feel like I knew the promotion was coming until it was media night, and it was Wednesday, and I was like, "Those fights are in 2 days." So like they certainly dropped the ball there, but in terms of like putting together exciting fights and like you said, signing those D1 wrestling prospects, I think they do a really good job building it. I think the big difference for me between them and PFL right now, because you're right, PFL has gotten a huge foothold in the United States as like a promotion. And I'll tell you what, I don't think the talent level in PFL right now is even as good as Bellator.
No,
And
it's not even close.
no, and it's not close to KSW. It might be closer to a Ryzen or a One FC. Because I personally think those promotions are probably a step below in terms of skill level after, you know, a KSW and a Bellator. But like the thing that they've got right is when they decided to reboot it, you know, away from World Series of Fighting and into this new, you know, concept here. It's not the season that sells people. And I know some people think it is the season thing that the PFL's got going on that gets people invested. The thing is they've got the right place for people to see it. Because at the end of the day, you know, you pointed out, Bellator is doing a Showtime show on tape delay, and I don't even have Showtime. Like I it's like impossible for me to watch Bellator because I don't have Showtime. So at the end of the day, like you have a whole bunch of people who don't watch Bellator because it's just like inconvenient to watch it, or it's on tape delay and their partners don't understand how live sports work. Whereas PFL probably took a below market deal to work with ESPN. And I'm almost guaranteeing they took a below market deal to work for ESPN because they probably could have gotten more money from CBS, who is reportedly was in the business of looking for you know, an MMA promotion at the time to do some work with. They could have, you know, looked at, you know, going back to a place like, I don't remember what Spike TV is called now, but Spike TV was still like kind of butting around there for a little while looking for promotions and stuff like that. They could have gone somewhere like that and probably gotten more money than ESPN. But at the end of the day, people now know PFL because if you turn on ESPN Plus and you turn on the ESPN app on your smart TV late at night on a Thursday, it's there. It's got its designated night. It's easy to watch. And that is the big missing piece from some of these other ones. Now, KSW is much easier to watch if you happen to be from Poland, right? Like, so they've got their own niche there. But like, I think that's what's missing in Bellator. Like, they could have that step up too if they just found a way to put themselves in some homes.
Yeah, it really bothers me. Look, I get why you go with Showtime, but like I guess I really don't because it's kind of this like dedication to like pay-per-view formats sometimes that like hold you back because there's a lot of competition out there. Like you cannot assume as a fighting promotion that you're the only one out there of it. People like to watch fights of good or bad quality. If there were just like bouncer brawls, like 52 that was like filmed in the back of like an abandoned pub, people would watch that.
Well, I mean, people keep watching Apex cards, right? Like that's the knock on what the UFC's new model is, right? Is that they gave ESPN all of these fight cards and they say they're going to have all these fight cards. And then you have them headlined by, you know, Kennedy Zachuku versus Ion Kudalaba, headlined a fight card in 2022. Now, I know there were some circumstances that led to that happening, but like people complained about that fight card incessantly after it was over. But you know what happened too? I watched it beginning to end. Do you want to know why? Because it was on ESPN Plus. It was on a Saturday, and it was on a convenient, easy way for me to watch it. And like, you're right. People will watch stuff if they can watch it. Like, especially MMA fans, right? Like, we come from a niche sport here that we like watching. That, at least when I was growing up, was damn near impossible to watch. Like, I could not watch I could not watch very much MMA growing up because it wasn't on ESPN. It wasn't even on Spike TV for the most part when I was growing up. You know, like when the Spike TV deal came around and I used to get UFC Fight for the Troops on Spike TV, I was jacked up. And you know what I used to watch instead? I used to watch WEC as a kid because it was on Versus. It was easy for me to get a hold of. It's a sport that we grew up in not having tons of access to. So now, if you want to cash in on whatever segment you're looking to cash in on, access is still a big piece to it.
But isn't that insane too? That like part of the reason that we have such fond memories of watching the WEC and feeling like you're in on like the world's coolest secret at the time is that like that was kind of the power of like those early stars they had. Like in the same way that Chuck Liddell is known to millions of people who have never watched a mixed martial arts fight ever as the Iceman, is the same reason that people look at Uriah Faber and are like, that guy looks familiar. Does he fight? It's like, yeah, that's a California kid, Uriah Faber. And to think, dude, the era of WEC and Strikeforce nipping at the UFC, and then Bellator was probably what, number 4 at the time? And this was at the time, like, Dream and Sengoku were still like kind of things. Like some promotion would get a bunch of money and lose it all after the first event because you ended up with Kimbo Slice versus Jason Thompson or something. But I love when there's like a handful of really good promotions, and we've had a good run of that. There's been a lot of good eras. And the UFC, when there's someone who gets a little too close in competition, or they have something that they want that they can't get into the market for, they've bought it. And for the most part, I mean, that's been cool. I don't know if that works out the best for the people in whose livelihood this affects. I don't know, but that's the big credit to PFL, is like they found a few things that they could make their own that were marketable, and they those are the things they had the most success with. Anthony Pettis was their poster boy for like a few months, and then he started losing. And, Rory didn't have, perfect runs in there. He was real up and down. And didn't he lose or should have lost to Sadabu Sai? Like it wasn't the UFC stars coming over to the PFL, the former UFC fighters. That wasn't where they did really well. Where they did really well was Clarissa Shields and Kayla Harrison. Like, they made people care about a weight class that technically doesn't even exist. It was the Clarissa Shields thing was fun. Bellator or PFL, I will say, like decent heavyweight division. The Henan Ferreira and Capoloza and I was almost
Ante Dalia.
Yeah, Dalia and Scheffel, who looked like way better this time around. Like their heavyweight division was good. I mean, it's about as good as any heavyweight division in operation right now. Like it's a weird state for heavyweight.
Yeah, I'd agree, but I just say this too. So like you're saying they made us care about Kayla Harrison. And first of all, I'll debate that. I don't care about Kayla Harrison in a made up division. That nobody who actually fits that division is fighting in, right? Like Sarah McMahon just joined the organization, and they're like, featherweight Sarah McMahon ain't fought at featherweight in 20 years. But the thing is, again, we're talking about access, because you're talking to, when you were talking about WEC and all the stars that they made and how they made you feel like you were on the inside track on Uriah Faber or Dominic Cruz. Dude, Dream was putting on cards right then at that time that were better than WEC. They were way better than WEC. They had a fight card with Shinya Aoki defending his lightweight championship, and they had a tournament that was won by Bibi Fernandez, who still is one of the most underrated bantamweights of all time. He won a Grand Prix that night that, included Joe Warren, the baddest man on earth, Joe Warren, and Takoro, who's still fighting now on Rising cards. And it included Minowa Man and Sokaju. And like, dude, they had legit legends like, like I said, Sakuraba and Sokaju and stuff like that. They had legit dudes fighting on the same weekends we had WEC cards going on. But there's a reason people don't nostalgically think about watching Bibi Fernandez win a one-night tournament, including a win over Joe Warren. There's a reason they don't think about, Sokaju winning an open weight Grand Prix all in one night. There's a reason they don't think back to all that, and it's access. So again, they would care about those things. And I don't know that the PFL is doing anything special to make us care about Kayla Harrison other than putting her as the headliner on a whole bunch of easily accessible shows. Because at the end of the day, these smaller promotions are only going to make waves. And I do say just smaller promotions, being they're smaller than the UFC and they will probably never catch up. But they will only make waves in doing what they want to do in the way that PFL does if they make themselves easily accessible to new fans and old fans.
Now, I definitely think, I mean, from a quality perspective, I love I'm not the first person to say it. I love the fanfare of any of the Asian promotions, and like just watching old Pride fights. And then, some of that element, I think, was very tastefully carried over to Dream. And it's like you're watching almost like a different planet. Like it immerses itself in the drama so well. And there's also like just weird things about Pride. Jose Canseco's fighting the Korean giant. Bob Sapp. Bob Sapp? Yeah.
Bob Sapp showed up there all the time. Sure. Yeah, he was there whenever he felt like it.
Warren Sapp was the good football player. Bob Sapp is the guy that for some reason chose to have a career in fighting.
Yes, correct.
There's the element of like they do some different stuff, the open weight tournaments, the Japanese pro wrestling exhibitions where it's like Fedor having like a slap grapple shudo boxing fight with Shinya Aoki. And it's just funny that like with Dream, at one point their lightweight champion was Shinya, who I get so much hate for like saying I like him, and it is kind of frustrating to watch a dude in tights scoot across a whole cage, trying to pull you into his rubber guard when he's not biting. Their middleweight champion was Gegard Mousasi. And wasn't their heavyweight champion at the same time Alistair Overeem? Did he beat Todd Duffy for that at one point? Or am I thinking a different
Yeah, I don't know if that's the right promotion, but I will say he definitely beat Todd Duffy. But I feel like that was almost as the promotion was falling apart. I could be wrong, but I feel like that was in the promotion was sort of falling apart.
Yeah, well, Todd Duffy was in their main event.
Yeah, that's pretty much, this is a tangent, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Man.
Yeah. And so I think Todd Duffy gets an unnecessary amount of hate. That dude had a pretty incredible run until like the mass public convinced him he was something different than he was. Like he was still a budding prospect. He was never like, and he's good, right? Like we even to this day can talk about the fact that like, he's objectively not bad, but he was like in development in the UFC. He came to the UFC with a very, very, very short record. Like, right. Like he was not a like well-experienced dude when he got to the UFC. I think he was 5-0 and he knocked out Tim Hague really easily in 7 seconds. And everybody's like, greatest fighter who's ever lived. Right. Like this dude is on a trajectory to the moon. Right. And then he was beating the shit out of Mike Russo and he gets the upset knockout, right? Mike Russo pulls out the hammer fist of doom. And that was the last, well, not the last time, but then the UFC let him go after that. And I can't remember if it was a contract dispute or what, but then he became like this punchline, this joke, right? And which is silly because he fought Russo, who he's beating the hell out of, and then Overeem, and then he fought like a couple of guys on the regional circuit, came back to the UFC, picked up a couple more knockout wins, didn't beat Frank Mir. But again, like it's Frank Mir. Like why was he getting a main event against Frank Mir when he was still, a relative prospect? So I think that in the long run, I think the matchmakers / the public hype around Todd Duffy did that dude a lot of disservice.
Yeah, but like there's always those guys that we do that too, and it doesn't seem like there's anything we can do about it. Cause like, it's like if you don't steer into the skid and try to profit off of that amount of hype and attention. All right, let's say Chase Hooper or let's take or something maybe like Ian Gary. I don't know. Like it seems like there's a lot of guys that are set up to do like way too much is expected. I mean, Patty, obviously, but like, guys like Patty and Sean are able to like, who cares if a bunch of people hate me? Like I have turned these wins against these, like this burgeoning yet still like underwhelming level of competition, even though, you know, they're taking steps up. But like at the end of the day, they're half personality. Some of these guys that we do a disservice to, you know, Todd Duffy, it's a case of bad timing. Like if Todd Duffy had been around and fighting in the UFC, say like, let's say it's like a decade later, he could have been a star. People might have loved him. And especially because it sounds like he was one of the first dudes in that era of the UFC to, you know, kind of butt heads with Dana on fighter pay. Because I'm just looking at this Wikipedia now, and that is what is rumored to have been the issue. Would you be surprised by a fighter getting frustrated with Dana White over that?
No, but here's the other thing too, though. So I think you're right. Maybe a decade later he does well, but at the end of the day, like the thing that set him apart was he like got unfavorable matchups due to his hype, right? Like we just decided, you know, the guy got let go of the UFC, you know, if it was fighter pay, through fighter pay, after being knocked out by Mike Russo in a comeback fight. And Russo was a Pride veteran and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, no shame in that loss. I actually think Mike Russo probably also comes out with a little bit of unfair treatment. Then he fights Overeem. And then he comes back to the UFC after, you know, beating a guy or two on the regional scene. He gets 2 quick knockouts and they're like main event against Frank Mir. Like Frank Mir, former champion Frank Mir, is going to fight you in the main event. And to me, that's where they do him dirty more than us just hyping him up, because they hyped him up and then they matched him up like the UFC matchmakers believe the hype, because which I think is crazy, because you know, you mentioned Sean O'Malley and you mentioned Paddy Pimblett. The thing about Sean O'Malley and Paddy Pimblett is they are not fighting. I mean, with Sean, the exception of Sean now having fought Piotr Jan and Chito Vera, but like Paddy Pimblett hasn't fought anybody. Like his toughest fight is against Jared Gordon. Dude, right now, Chase Hooper has more fights against top 15 UFC fighters than Paddy Pimblett does. That's a fact. Right now, Chase Hooper has fought exactly one who just knocked out Paddy Pimblett's toughest fight in his whole career. Like that is a true statement. So Chase Hooper is out here fighting tougher dudes. So, you know, like Chase Hooper, to my, you know, like my opinion, is being slower played than Todd Duffy was. And maybe it's because he's not a hulking heavyweight and, you know, like it's easier to not push him along. But even he's going faster than Paddy Pimblett, which is insane to say. So like I think to an extent, yeah, it is a little bit of the public claim, but how much of the UFC's ability to like, you know, pull the reins back and be like, whoa, you know, like this guy is not ready to main event against Frank Mir. He's going to come out throwing windmill punches and get himself knocked out by a dude who doesn't even knock people out anymore. The UFC's ability to take that step back and realize how they want to market people, I think they do a really exceptional job with some people. Whether they were trying to or not with Sean O'Malley, knocked it out of the park. They extracted every single little bit of value they could out of that guy. And if they run him against Aljamain Sterling on the main event of a pay-per-view sometime soon, they'll hit a freaking jackpot, because they took a guy who early in his career had very little and very limited defensive wrestling skills. And they brought him up in such a way that one day he could arguably beat Piotr Jan. And I know some people don't think he won that fight, but arguably beat Piotr Jan, a dude who's really good wrestler and a really good striker. They figured it out with him. They're trying to do the same thing with Paddy. And then sometimes they just whiff so freaking hard.
I mean, like Sage Northcutt is the one that they forced the most, I feel like. You know, Sage had done almost nothing. Even when he won, it was like he was gassing. He looked like hesitant to pull the trigger. He was lost. I mean, I don't know who liked that. Like, I don't hate Sage Northcutt, but like, I'm not really a fan. He's a very interesting dude to follow. Like the video of him trying seasoning on chicken for the first time with Tyron Woodley, like him, like his old like tweets surfacing that it was like frick chores, like hilarious. But they tried so hard to force the Sage Northcutt thing. And even at the time, I was like, dude, I'm not buying it. Like, he's in this commercial with Mighty Mouse and Forrest Griffin. Like, who is this dude? He's like, you can tell when they're forcing it. And you can't force those things, and it looks bad when it's forced. But, you know, like, Patty Pimblett, all right, let's throw away the results. Forget about the judges' scorecards against Jared Gordon, because, close fights, if you let it go to the distance, you leave open that possibility. And judges should be able to get it right. We're all watching the fights. We don't seem to have a problem scoring it to a competent level. But when it goes to the scorecard, that is the possibility that you leave open. Forget about the scores. Patty Pimblett just didn't look impressive against Jared Gordon. And that was a big strikeout for them when you're marketing him pretty much as the headliner for a pay-per-view that for a main event that I didn't even know beforehand how much Dana White already couldn't stand it. But I love that this is the kind of sport where you can see like a fight for a vacant title and you can be like, no, that sucked. We're going to do two different guys because that was horrible. It wasn't a horrible fight. Dana gets like Dana. He's been doing that for like 20 years. I don't pretend to know how that dude's brain works. I don't, but I have to say, dude, where do you think he ranks among pro sports commissioners in the United States? Where do you think he ranks with Adam Silver and Rob Manfred and whoever else, and Roger Goodell? And then there's probably commissioners of the other ones too. Where do you think he ranks?
So, obviously, domestic violence issue aside, which we obviously just have to, throw that out there because we don't want to throw the personal issues completely off the table. But no. I think that the difference in their success is what they're trying to do. So, like, if you look at, a Rob Manfred, a lot of people hate Rob Manfred, right? Like, a lot of people are like, does this guy even like baseball? But here's the thing that Rob Manfred has done. He's put together a collective bargaining agreement over, his tenure, which, by the way, was pretty contentious, wound up making the season a week late and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's incentivized the teams to go out there and to spend money. And, the more aggressive, competitive balance tax, the way that it tiers itself now and it bumped itself up. You got the Mets spending damn near $500 million this upcoming year. Like, he's basically made it so that these baseball players, and not just the very best of the best, these baseball players are going to eat. They're going to clean up in the near future, and it's only going to get better from here. So like, I think he's done a great job at that. Talking about the rule changes, me as a former college baseball player, I hate the rule changes. I think the rule changes are the dumbest thing in the sport. Like, I don't like the idea of a pitch clock. I was a pitcher in college. I don't like the idea of somebody telling me I've only got so many seconds before I can let it go. I pitch at my pace. I don't like banning the shift. I think the shift is, you don't like the shift, hit the other way into it. But you know what he's doing is he's marketing it to young fans. That's what he's doing. He's marketing baseball to younger fans, to people who want to see a certain aesthetic. He's doing it so that it is more watchable on TV, and he's getting his players money. So if we're talking about, at the end of the day, whether or not a commissioner is successful, like, to me, everybody hates Rob Manfred. Everybody thinks Rob Manfred's an ass. But at the end of the day, I think what he's doing for the sport is brilliant. You could say similar things about Adam Silver. You could say similar things. I'm less of a other sports fan and more of a baseball fan anyway. You could say similar things about Goodell, right? People hate Goodell. He gets booed when he does the NFL draft. NFL ratings and NFL TV deals are at all-time high. They're printing money every single time they need to do a TV deal. So, but the thing about Dana White is that Dana White's job out here is not to make sure the sport grows, to make sure the younger fans see this and are like, yes, this. Dana White's job is to stick Dana White's name in as many people's tongues as he possibly can, and to make Dana White look like he is a unreplaceable piece to the puzzle, right? Like, so many people have posted Twitter polls like, who's going to replace Dana White when he leaves? How about fucking anybody, dude? Like, it's not that he's not good at what he does. Like, he wouldn't still be there if he wasn't still good at what he does. I agree with that. But it's not like somebody couldn't step in and put fights together and know what's marketable, right? Like, could he be one of the better ones for the job? Yes, but he's not so unreplaceable. What he's done that is better than all of those other commissioners that you mentioned is he's made his name sound like it is the sport. So much so, he's actually put his name on 2 different entities since then, right? We have Dana White's Contender Series, which is a direct pipeline to the UFC. We now have that godforsaken Dana White Slab League, which, as long as TBS comes to their senses and cancels it in the next week, maybe we won't have it. But like, both of those things have his name on it. Could you imagine if it was called the Adam Silver Summer League? Right, because that's essentially what he did. He took the feeder league and he put his own name on it in branding. So like, we don't have an Adam Silver Summer League. So it's hard to rank these guys against one another because I think their objectives are different. 3 or 4 of those guys are out to make this their sports the next biggest thing and to make sure that a newer, younger audience of people, takes that thing in. And another one is posting videos of himself eating a Cheeto smoothie so that he can make sure that he's what kids remember.
I mean, do you feel like that? Because like, I'm not saying that feeling doesn't exist for other people. I'm just saying, like, I don't get like rubbed the wrong way by like Dana White's Contender. It's just not what I feel like he's doing. The parts of Dana that I did. And again, like, any allegations of domestic violence, they can't be factored into this conversation, of course, because that's a way different variable. So let's just assume that every person we're talking about has not done something so like
we're talking about it from a business perspective. Yeah.
But that's the thing is that like, Dana's not a commissioner. He's not like the other dudes we listed, but he's the closest thing that like the UFC and the sport kind of has. And I think the unfortunate part is that like Dana White doesn't necessarily have to like super blow out promote himself. Yeah, because he's been there from the beginning and because he was a big part of I don't think it can be understated that like Dana's presence on the first Ultimate Fighter season was very important. And he has built an audience. There's a reason that like, Adam Silver isn't going on like podcasts with like, I don't know how old those dudes are, like what, 26 or something. Like he's going on like, these podcasts with these younger dudes and going to Vegas with them and stuff. And then he's beefing with Jake and Logan Paul, and he's friends with Mike Tyson, and he's hanging out with Donald Trump. For whatever he has this like, he has the demographic of like 16 to like 30-year-old dudes. He's always had a really good pocket of them ever since they were on Spike TV peddling amped mobile cell phones.
But isn't that what? So I think you kind of made my point for me though, is that like he's out there peddling himself in I do debate whether or not this is intentional. He wouldn't stick his name on 2 different entities if it wasn't intentional. And I would also say too, you just mentioned, the Ultimate Fighter, and when he was on the Ultimate Fighter and you felt his presence, of course you felt his presence. That was his first time to have a national TV audience that was him, not the fighters, right? Like that was his first time to stick himself in front of a camera and say, look at me, I'm here and I'm in charge of these guys and I can tell these guys what to do. And of course, like what 17 or 18-year-old kid at that time wouldn't be like, oh yeah, that guy's a boss. He's ordering all those fighters around. Like that was by design. He from the very beginning, I believe, has done an excellent job of marketing Dana White. And he hasn't been there from the beginning, but he has been from the beginning of the Zuffa era, and he's made himself look indispensable from then. But also remember, he's a person they put in charge of like bits and pieces of the business, but not all of the business, right? Like now Hunter Campbell and Endeavor runs a whole bunch of it. And back then the Fertitta brothers ran a whole bunch of it. He was just the face. He was just the guy who was in the spotlight. And again, I'm not debating whether or not he's done a good job, but when we're talking about success of a sport in success of what a commissioner is doing for that sport, you're right. He's the closest thing the UFC/MMA has to a commissioner, but really all his goal has always been is to make UFC so synonymous with the sport that people forget it's called MMA and instead call it UFC. And people know that he's the reason we tune in. And I think he does a great job at that. That makes him maybe probably a really good businessman. But I also think it makes us impossible to compare him between him and Adam Silver because they don't even remotely have the same goals.
Yeah, all right. We could keep going on that for there's a lot of stuff to say about it, and we haven't even touched fighter pay, which was a big 2022 than it ever was before. And you know, one of the weird things, and maybe this will spark another big thing, but of all things, dude, who put Amanda Serrano on a platform over the last like year and a half? And who was it that in some way on God's green earth got more people than ever before talking about fighter pay in the UFC? Somehow it was Jake Paul. Am I wrong?
No, you're right. But here's the thing too. And like, you always have to take the good thing that comes out of a situation, no matter what, right? Because what he's done, right, is he's made people talk about it, and you have to give him credit for that. But also, like, how much of that is also to buy himself some sort of credibility, to buy himself some sort of, because like, what also logical steps has he taken to help things other than being the one saying them? Because I agree with you. It's good that people are talking about it. People should have always been talking about it, especially after, you know, these terrible contracts came to light of, you know, what these guys are getting off of the Ultimate Fighter, or even now to this day, what these guys are getting off of Contender Series to debut in the UFC. They're making 10-10 straight out of Contender Series. And like, those numbers are crazy for this sport at this era, at this junction. And you're right. He got us talking about it, which is good. And that's a really important thing. But like, every single one of those fights, he was like, "Oh, you're going to help me start a fighters union. Oh, you're going to help me do that." There probably aren't any logical steps he could take, but also like, he keeps saying he's going to buy himself good credibility. So like, you know, I appreciate that some good has come of it, but how much of it do you think is he actually wants to do something, and how much of it do you think is that he wants to chap Dana White's balls? Because I tend to think it's the latter more than the former.
Well, sure, but there's very few people that even have that ability through, you know, both their resources and like who their personality is to, you know, instigate that kind of a ripple effect. You know, it's a rare individual, and like, dude, that's the thing. Like, it would take me probably about like 5 minutes being around like any of those, like, you know, Jake Paul or Logan. I don't know what those dudes are like, dude. They're so famous and rich for the craziest reasons that, like, I don't know what those dudes are like. And I'm not surprised to hear that sometimes they're like not that cool. Dana, you know, the same thing. He's been living in Vegas as, you know, the most famous promoter in mixed martial arts, making a ton of money. And I don't know what he's been doing with it. Jake Paul has his theories, and he's got famous friends. You know, that's a different, but, you know, Jake Paul, it's kind of like, you know, of course he has motivation. Of course he has corrupt motivations. You know, of course that he's saying stuff to, you know, keep the thing with Dana White going, because it continues the conversation of like, will Jake Paul ever transition to MMA? Will Nate Diaz fight Jake Paul? Like, people love that stuff. And Dana loves to say like, no, it'll never happen. You'll never see that. What do we know about Dana when he says something will never happen, Gumby?
It comes. Yeah, it happens. Women fighting in MMA. I think Cyborg coming to the UFC was never going to happen. Like they show up, right?
I mean, if you told Dana, you know, a decade ago that McGregor Mayweather happened, or Anderson Silva, Jake Paul, or Tyron Woodley, yeah, it became a different thing. That's the thing. I really like to think, best case scenario, I don't think Dana White's a bad guy at all. I think all he cares about is money. I don't think he hates any particular. I'd like to think that he doesn't hate any particular group or treat anybody differently for who they are. But whenever the money talks, he has always changed his mind. Every single time the money has talked, he has changed his mind. If Paul Daly had been the best and most famous and marketable welterweight in the world, he would have fought Josh Koscheck 5 more times under the UFC banner. Every time there's been when he said, Dana, when will women be in the UFC? Never. And people still look at that and go, "Oh," and I'm like, dude, he's just trying to piss you off. Like when he says fighter pay will never be increased, he's lying. He's going to change it when he decides that it is the most profitable time for him to change it. I don't know what he's waiting for, and I'm not trying to give him any extra credit. Like he always has a grand, brilliant scheme, but I think he always has his reasons, flawed as they may be sometimes. And it just seems every time that he's figured like, this is the time to pull the trigger. Now I can make money on this. Ronda Rousey, I can make so much money on it, and I can get credit for changing like the atmosphere of sports around the world. Ronda Rousey's a rock star now. His words. And that's the thing why you can't even like, it's so hard to talk about MMA over the last 20 years without dedicating a big chunk of the conversation to Dana White, because it's like he's there and he makes those decisions, and as corrupt as that motivation might be sometimes, it's like he's always there, and you're right, he has made himself absolutely synonymous with the sport. There's very few people that like run in whatever capacity, big sports organizations that could do that. Like I think Rob Manfred would be on like a reality show for like 5 minutes before you see the ratings start dropping. I'm not a big Manfred fan. No, I was about to say something about Rob Manfred. I was about to make a counterpoint to what you said about Rob Manfred before. We can't do that, Gumby. Let's talk about some MMA in 2022. And speaking of which, PFL Challenger Series, the second one that they're doing this year, it's on February 3rd. And folks, PFL Challenger Series, they're gonna have 4 fights, all one weight class on a single event. I think it starts like the week before February 3rd. I can't do that going back a month math. And that's going to be super accessible on Fubo TV. And it's the second one is 4 fights at women's featherweight. A bunch of, I think like combined record here is like, the combined record for all 4 fighters is like 9-3 or something, like 9-2. It's just, PFL's doubling down. You see what they're doing here? They're creating prospects for a division that was dissipating month by month before our eyes. It was a special division that came out kind of like when the timing was right for Amanda Nunes in between bantamweight title defenses. It was like Megan Anderson, done. Felicia Spencer, done. Damn, what do we do now? Aspen Ladd's not working out, and the other, best 50% of women in the world at this weight class are over in Bellator. That's, it was Julia Budd and it was Cyborg and, the Bling Cat, and now Kat Zingano. The women have done a lot better going over to Bellator from the UFC than dudes have.
Yeah, I will say this too, though, about, because you touched on originally at the beginning there that they're kind of just putting together, fights that were shocked are happening at such a high level, right? Because you got, I think I saw the combined record of all of them is like, I want to say it was like 16-1 between the 8 ladies who were on that fight card. I will say this, though, I think they're taking a page out of Bellator's book, only better. Because, Bellator was like, hey, we're going to go get these D1 wrestlers, but then we're going to bury them on the freaking prelims, which you can watch maybe on YouTube or something like that. And, like after they've won 3 or 4, we'll get them to a Showtime card, and then people will actually get to see them. These guys, first of all, are putting them where you can see them, but second of all, they're getting big names too. Like, and I know they're not going out and getting Division 1 wrestlers, but there are some people who, diehard fans or people who watch other combat sports have seen, like Amanda Leve is going to be fighting on that card. She's a jiu-jitsu world champion. She's been in Abu Dhabi. She's been at Polaris events. She's been at Metamoris events. Like she's just like a very high level MMA fighter. And she's going to fight, I'm going to butcher the name, but Naran Jargal, who is a Mongolian judo specialist. She took silver at the world champions not that long ago. And, she's won juniors, and she was a Mongolian national champion a bunch of times. And, she placed at the Asian games and stuff like that. Like she is a high level judo specialist who I just watched fight in PFL the other day. It was like 3 months ago. And she beat the hell out of Cheyenne Bowers, who Cheyenne Bowers was, a debuting fighter, but she was a highly touted amateur who had fought for LFA and FAC and all of the like good regional promotions. I want to say she was like 7-8-1 as an amateur. So like they thought they were giving Cheyenne Bowers a decent fight, and instead she got tossed in scarf hold armbar in like no time at all. So like they found, I think, what they deemed to be like the up and coming wrestler types that the UFC has found, or the Bellator has found. You're even getting that in the main event of the 170-pound challenger series. Hulk Barbosa's on there. Anybody who follows competitive grappling knows the name Hulk Barbosa. Like that dude, sometimes they just call him Hulk and everybody knows who they're talking about, because like he's that good and he's that famous. So like they're going and finding people who are legit, like who do have a reason to be there at 1-0 or 2-0. They're big enough names. And they're putting them in a place where you can see them. So I actually think they're doing better than Bellator in naming some of these prospects.
Yeah, I think PFL is doing a lot of things right. Like I find that like in fight, like score based on their like, metrics.
Oh, I hate that.
I hate it. It's either really obvious or I'm like stunned by how wrong I think it is. Like it's
and also let's just talk about their smart gauge for just like 4 seconds. I don't care how fast the punch is, because it turns out you could throw a really fast punch, miss somebody's head completely, and that it turns out that punch doesn't really matter.
Yeah, there's some stuff that like I don't know why they do it, but they're going with a theme, so I get it. Some of the stuff they do is corny, but I feel like they Grand Prix and tournaments are nothing new in MMA, and that's like the absolute root of the sport at a professional level, and in a lot of ways it's what makes it great. But their playoff system was good. It did incentivize finishes, and their per diem was terrible. And it's weird, like not a lot of people mention that. And a lot of the UFC people that come in, they're like, I'm going to come and like get paid more with the PFL. And it's like, well, like, yeah, I would assume so. Like you're a way bigger deal over here. And like, yeah, you're going for the million. I get it, but like, that's not going to be the case for everybody on PFL. But the $1 million prize for the champion, that is compelling. I mean, that's for 99.9 to the billion. That is a life-changing amount of money for a mixed martial arts fighter. Conor McGregor, he probably wouldn't even recognize it. But, that is a great format. And doing a playoff system with points that incentivizes finishes, that's very clever. I do like that. In a playoff system with seeding, that's fair. I like it. They discovered some of their best, what drew me to PFL and what draws me to, every organization outside the UFC, especially at a major level, is either, the prospects that they have, or like who is, the best here in terms of who here is the highest on their respective weight class ranking board in the world for this organization. And, for a bit, I was pretty sure that like Ray Cooper was at minimum a top. I really thought Ray Cooper for a time was like a top 15, top 12 welterweight. He looked that good for a little bit. And it just seems like the PFL system doesn't necessarily lend itself to like consistency season from season, because we haven't seen much of it. Even Kayla Harrison in a weight class that Like we thought we were going to see her dominate until they decided to, cash out with her and they get a fight with her and somebody big cross promotion, or, she just ends up signing with the UFC. It's those guys that draw me to organizations. And that's what kind of like is still a little bit lagging behind from the PFL is, a new upstart organization that's spending a lot of money and they're bringing a lot of it in, but they have to use that to compete. So they're getting people that are recognizable, but it's like, I don't really care that much about seeing Jeremy Stevens fight anymore, regardless of where it was. That fight with him and Clay Collard was awesome, but I'm not like super invested in the outcome of a Jeremy Stevens fight. And like I said with Showtime, they tried to make him the poster boy for a little bit, and then he lost, and it's like, well, damn, like I know PFL that you are not the first organization to lose money because you thought that you could like skate by for a bit on the leftover like UFC standouts that are looking to come over here or have had a bad run in the UFC. It's like Bellator, that's what bothers me about Bellator, and it's something you can only get with a Scott Coker promotion, but I love it at the same time. It's like, how can you have their featherweight division and their lightweight division and, the guys that we saw come up at welterweight and middleweight over the last couple of years, and then like to see what their heavyweight Grand Prix was like a few years ago, just an absolute freak show. And I didn't want to see any of those guys lose, but I really didn't want to see any of them win either. And then the light heavyweight tournament kind of turned into a disaster. But that tournament wasn't devoid of quality. Yeah, I love Grand Prix where a title's on the line, and the UFC doesn't do that. And so that from Bellator really intrigues us, especially at a time where like I definitely think that Vadim Nemkov at his best right now could maybe 3 out of 10 times given a UFC light heavyweight title shot could maybe come out with the belt. Like the as you go up to light heavyweight, the gap between like the UFC and Bellator really goes down.
I think that's true of the world, though. Like, not even just Bellator and the UFC. Like, I think the variance between the very best heavyweight fighters and the light heavyweight fighters in the world, the difference between them and, somebody who can make it as a pro, as a light heavyweight, there's more variance because sometimes it's just a one hitter quitter. And then we're talking about a new champ half the time. But also to sort of your point there, where you were just talking about, how you really believed Ray Cooper was the best, and then they some kind of thwarted you. And it seems like PFL hired all of these UFC rejects and it didn't work out for them and they screwed it up. And meanwhile, Bellator is hiring these UFC rejects and they're sticking around and they're filling their Grand Prix and stuff. I think a lot of that is due to the fact that I think while the PFL format can be super intriguing, I think part of the problem with it is that, and I've actually heard this from fighters too. Olivier Aubin-Mercier has told me these exact words. Stevie Ray has told me these exact words. And it's the PFL season does not really lend itself to getting better. The PFL season lends itself to keeping you really fit, to keeping you in fight shape all the time, but you don't make a mistake in a fight and then come back in a couple months and have fixed that and done better at it, because martial arts doesn't change like that. Like you have to put the time in to fix the thing, right? Like when we saw Chase Hooper disappear after he got beat up pretty badly one time, he went and fixed some things. And he had to go fix some things. And did he fix enough things at the end of the day? No, not even. But that's the thing that lends itself to having the best guys stick around at the top, the Vadim Nemkov stick around the top. And that's the thing that makes the Ray Coopers disappear into the distance, because if he goes out there and makes a mistake in a fight, that format that exists incentivizes him to go balls to the wall in the first round of the next fight after that. And it's only going to be 2 months later. So if that dude gets slept in the third round with an unlucky punch, and all of a sudden he knows he's down in this new season format, and it's even worse now because the regular season now has only got 2 fights in it instead of it used to have 3 or 4, right? Now Ray Cooper has to go out and act like a madman in round 1, and maybe that's not his best game plan. Maybe that's not when he's at his absolute best. So while I find PFL's structure very entertaining from time to time, I think it does two things. I think it takes people completely out of their fights, and it produces winners and sometimes champions who I don't actually believe are the best in the division. I'll continue to say that I think Renan Faria is the best heavyweight in PFL. If you give him a full fight camp and you let his body recover and you give him time to work on whatever weakness he had in his last fight, I still think he's the best in the world. Or the best in PFL rather. And like, if he was in Bellator, he would have that time to do those things. And instead, in PFL, they make you do something different. And I think that is, like you said, it's entertaining in a way because you're getting to see, fights that have meaning and, have incentive behind it. And the $1 million thing continues to be intriguing. I heard Charles Rosa is negotiating with the PFL right now. He's trying to escape the UFC because he thinks he can go win a smooth million and stash that away in the bank and then come back to the UFC and be a star. And like, that will always be intriguing. But at the end of the day, like, I don't think we're getting the best quality content and the best quality fights out of those fighters, or the best versions of those fighters as we can under that format.
No, and that's why it's great to see them doing stuff like the Challenger Series, because it shows that like they have an exit or a transition strategy from this, because look, Olivier Aubin-Mercier, he was a competitive UFC lightweight. He's been competitive everywhere he's gone. And it sounds like you've had him on your show as a guest. I'm sure he's a very nice guy. But like him as a lightweight champion of an organization that's, at that level of notoriety it's just not that compelling. And they had to have, that format and the intrigue of Kayla Harrison and Clarissa Shields. They had to have that there, to kind of prop up the other weight classes for a little bit,
I think you're right. I think they did need some of that name value to pull it over, but it probably helped accelerate how quickly PFL picked up, especially with diehard fans. But again, kind of to the point we've beat to death in all of this, would it have got there eventually anyway? Just being on ESPN, being available, being the thing that we want to watch. Like, what if I didn't have to tune in and watch Jeremy Stevens get knocked out for the 37th time, or Marlon Moraes, he put on a perfect game plan only to get knocked out in the third round yet again. Oh, no. What if I didn't have to watch that because they just decided to hire Ray Cooper's little brother instead, who's also a damn good fighter, by the way? Or what if they had just decided, to start grabbing some of these BJJ athletes, these Hulks and stuff like that, and just started implementing them? Would we have come to a place where like everybody was like, oh, that PFL is a real joke? Or would everybody be like, hey, PFL keeps putting on fights on Thursday, I'm going to keep watching them? Like, I think even if they had the talent level of LFA, and first of all, I love LFA. I think LFA is one of the greatest feeder promotions that exists today.
Oh, yeah.
I think if they had the talent level of LFA and just stayed that course, ran the same exact format, I think within, maybe not as fast as they did, but I think they would gain a market share, the same level of market share eventually, just by being on ESPN and by running that format. Like the names that came out of it would eventually appear, right? Like Ray Cooper came out of nowhere. None of us knew who Ray Cooper was prior to that, unless you're a guy who's got your pulse or your finger on the regional MMA pulse. You did not know Ray Cooper before he was in PFL. So what separates him from, any of the guys fighting in LFA? LFA this weekend, Felipe Bunes. Like, what's separating Felipe Bunes from Ray Cooper? What's separating Yuma Horiguchi from Ray Cooper? What's separating Ari Farias from Ray Cooper? And it's exposure, right? Like, it's the fact that, when we flip on ESPN, it's there. When we flip on the ESPN, it's there. I don't just flip on the Fight Pass app unless I know what I'm looking for. And they don't have all the bells and the whistles and the Randy Couture's announcing it. So I think it would have gotten there anyway, but I agree to your point. Like, it accelerated it, right? Like, going and having Anthony Pettis do 6 commercials for it right next to his Toyo Tires commercials probably certainly helped it. Having Kayla Harrison, who, you know, they're going to keep shoving in our faces the best in the world, despite the fact that she just lost. Like that definitely helped it. But I think just the accessibility, the ability to be on ESPN in the intriguing format, I think they might have gotten there anyway.
It's very powerful to be on ESPN, for sure. And, you know, I appreciate that they take advantage of times of the week where we feel ourselves starved for MMA. And Bellator, I feel like, is just straight up rude when they pick times to put on their events. It's like there won't even be UFC that week, and they're doing it like Friday at 2 p.m. in Ireland. And it's like, well, I'm going to miss it. I'm going to miss all the MMA because that's all there was. And then like it'll be a big UFC day, and they'll like start their like card like 2 hours after the UFC. And it's like, dude, why would you start before? Or why would you start after? Everybody's just going to turn on the UFC and not turn it away. There is nobody in this world outside of Silicon Valley who has a good enough router and a good enough computer to simultaneously watch the UFC on ESPN Plus and pirate a stream if you can find it of Bellator, because it being on Showtime, it does make it harder. But now it's like, that's the thing. What separates Ray Cooper from those dudes? Opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he got, and that's why the mixture of the you know, this has been a successful formula for Bellator. You know, you spend money to get big names, but ultimately you're not trying to make, you know, your product off of, you know, let's say you're not trying to make it off of Rampage Jackson in Bellator or you know, you're not trying to make it off of Tito Ortiz in Bellator.
You're trying to put Tito Ortiz in Rampage at the main event and hoping people catch on to Aaron Pico. Or hope,
dude, I was
like that's what they're doing, right? Like that's what they're doing. And that formula for Scott Coker has worked for a long time. Like, we're going to bring you in, we're going to show you Dan Henderson on a Strikeforce card. But in the meantime, I really hope you see Jacare fight Luke Rockhold, because that fight is I mean, that fight still to this day was a really good fight. And I walked away from it being like, man, both of those dudes are badass middleweights. And like that has been the Scott Coker format. But part of, and maybe this is again a benefit and a detriment to PFL, is part of that format doesn't lend itself to being like, okay, well, I'm going to stick Rory McDonald as the main event, or a shell of what Rory McDonald used to be, rather, as the main event. And I kind of hope you see this other thing. Instead, like, if Rory wins, he's going to beat those prospects next, right? Like, they could sort of hide Aaron Pico behind fights with, you know, some easier dudes. And granted, he's not going to win them all, but he's going to fight a Derek Anderson or something like that for a little while before he gets a, you know, a big name or a big scary dude or something like that. Whereas this PFL format doesn't allow that. Like, if you are in it, they're not hiding you on the under part of the card. And even these Challenger Series ones, right? Like, they're talking about these Challenger Series ones. The goal of that is that if they win well enough, they're in the series, right? So, you know, you've got these people here, you know, like take Hassan Graham, for instance. Hassan Graham is relatively unknown. 1-0 heavyweight is going to be on the PFL Challenger Series. I only know about him because he's from my neck of the woods. He hits like a truck. He was a high school and possibly college, definitely like a high school state champ wrestler, like super good dude to watch. He 1-0. If he wins, and he wins impressively, and the PFL is like, oh, cool, this guy, he's gonna fight Renan Faria. He's going to fight Ante Dalia. He's going to fight, you know, Capoloza, or he's gonna fight, you know, Sheffel, or it's like, he's gonna fight these dudes. And like, that's the PFL piece that like still kind of doesn't sit with me, is because like you are trying to build prospects, but at the same time, like, if you stick them in these tournaments with Olivier Aubin-Mercier, he's going to embarrass a Roush Manfio. And if you had just properly built Roush Manfio, I think he could be a star for you, right? In you know, I don't like the boxing model of bringing people up super slow and padding the shit out of the record, but like, there's a reason they do it too, right? It's because like at the end of the day, these fighters who are 30-0 are marketable and haven't put 6,000 miles on their tires. Whereas I don't think PFL lends itself to doing the same thing we're talking about Bellator and to an extent the UFC doing.
It's just funny because I was sitting there, while we're talking about the differences between these two organizations, and I was thinking, like, that's the problem. PFL does not have their Aaron Pico.
They can't have it. Right? It can't exist.
They don't have, and there's very few, like, there's people that you think of as career Bellator people. Like Alimale McFarlane is, she's been there through, a long body of the existence of that weight class for Bellator. The Juan Archuletas, the Patchy Mixes, the Pit Bulls, and then they have their Picos. And, you look at the Bellator rankings, which I'm really glad that everybody started doing rankings, because I was always wondering, like, what do these look like for Bellator and ONE? And I wish I could separate it on Tapology by organization, but it is not that sophisticated. Like light heavyweight, there's Phil Davis, Ryan Bader, Yoel Romero, but then they got 7-1 Grant Neal, 10-2 Alex Polizzi, 5-0 Sullivan Cauley, and heavyweight, hilarious. Their heavyweight ranks have been this funny for like a year. Ryan Bader at the top still. Valentin Moldavsky, whatever. There's a Valentin Moldavsky in every organization's top 10 heavyweight. Linton Vassell, who's like 38 years old. Fedor, who's 46. Chake Congo, who's 44, 45. Then you got a young guy, Steve Mowry, 10-0. Tim Johnson, he's like 40. Marcelo Gom Young, Daniel James, I don't know. He's pretty much in those rankings because he upset Tyrell Fortune, who's 12-3, and then Gokhan at 8-1.
Well, and I think some of the problem with those two is that, the Bellator saw the UFC's rankings and they tried to pitch their idea of rankings as being less flawed than the UFC's. And I know a lot of people out there have problems with the UFC's. I'm one of the voting panelists for the UFC. I still have problems with the UFC rankings. I still think they do a thing or two wrong. Particularly one of the problems I have with them is that, there's no real word for when a fighter is not active enough for, like Conor McGregor took forever to fall out of the rankings. He wasn't in my rankings for the last like 3 years or something like that. But he's still in the rankings because there was probably some dude still voting him at number 2 or number 3, and that's enough to keep him at 14 or 15. Right? When you do a collective rankings, that's how the cookie crumbles, right? But here's the thing is that, like, if you look at the Bellator ones, they were like, well, we're not going to make the same mistakes the UFC. We're going to have these really strict rules. The thing is, the Bellator rosters are not as deep as the UFC, right? UFC is 80 or 90 guys deep at lightweight. They're 100 people deep at bantamweight. And like, they've got room to do whatever they want. They could have really strict rules and still have a normal looking top 15. Bellator doesn't have that many dudes. Like, you have to imagine the people who fit that criteria. I mean, like, wasn't that WWE wrestler Jack Swagger in there for a bit at 2-0? And it was pretty much because they had 10 viable heavyweights that they could actually rank, and he was one of them. Because like they put this like really strict criteria on what's allowed to be ranked. And I think at the end of the day, you just wind up with kind of like a wash system. And that's not to say that what they're doing is wrong. Like, what they reflect is actually closer to showing you something, right? Because they want to show you, this is what a fighter who's fought this many times in this amount of area. And I don't even remember all the criteria, but like they've got this real strict criteria. Whereas the UFC's is just like, this is who we think is the best and who this panelist or this group of panelists we think is the best. So, yeah, like I think the disservice and why theirs looks so weird and has like all those guys on is just because like they might have better fighters, but like a lot of times those fighters don't fit that criteria.
I will say, even though there's only 6 fighters, or 7 counting the champion for Bellator's women's featherweight division, it's a strong lineup and complete with young prospects. Like, Bellator has done on like a much lower scale with their women's featherweight division and the way that they've like selected a few different prospects that's like, all right, we're feeling real strong about these few. It's been kind of like the surge of prospects that we've seen at UFC strawweight. There's like a big like collision between like, this is a promising fighter for this weight class. Like, she's really young and she is, you can match her up in competitive fights with people who have been doing this twice as long, but they also have a popularity factor. And that's the thing. Like, it's kind of uncomfortable. Like, some of the, I'm afraid of the day when like some of these like, main events are like in some sort of sponsorship deal with OnlyFans. And, that's obviously, and we talked about that last time with the Ultimate Fighter, like it's, no one's mentioning it. I'm not seeing any sign, but like, I just have a creeping feeling like, and I don't even know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. If the fighters are making more money from it and, it's definitely better fan engagement, then sure, but that is certainly a factor. You can't be so naive as to think that is not how the UFC and other organizations are kind of planning this out. It's like, we have to go for marketable too, especially in these weight classes. And Ronda Rousey's kind of been the blueprint for that. She was on she was in ESPN The Body. She was in several movies, even though from what I can tell, she's not that, good of an actor, above the WWE level at least. And, but because of that mixture of what she had and the fact that she was winning and she was a new thing that brought a whole different audience into the sport, that can be replicated to varying levels of success. And one day we'll probably see a fighter who's even bigger than Ronda Rousey for her own reasons. But I do think Bellator is good about developing their prospects. They're committing, to women's featherweight, at least to the point where they have an upper tier of Cyborg, Zingano, Blaine Cow, but then you got Sydney Kavanaugh, Leah McCourt. That's who can actually like breathe some life into that division and make it something that people want to watch. It's very interesting. The amount of prospects that there are to follow in this sport, and we see them, sometimes every single week when it's in season of Dana White's Contender Series, and every single weekend on UFC Fight Pass. There is so much fighting talent in this sport that, some have taken advantage of different pockets of it better than others. It's clear to me that like there's kind of an untapped, like people still kind of aren't realizing the potential of like South African fighters. And people love Australians and New Zealand fighters. Those are always big sellers, especially when you take it back home. But like the South African guys and like, more so, guys that fight in KSW and in EFC, they have like a funky style about them. And, Rita Fogat, she was a crazy draw for what she was and for what, she still is. But, there's a lot of untapped potential too in a lot of Middle Eastern markets for MMA. And some organizations take better advantage of it than others. And that's, one's geographical placement, Ryzen's geographical placement gives them that opportunity. But okay, Daniel, so we've said Chase Hooper's name several times. We've said Patty and Sean. I'll throw two other guys into the mix too, because we're talking about prospects that have been, kind of treated dirty or done disservices to. And it goes in well to some guys that have had good years in 2022. Not this guy, but did Greg Hardy. Not only did they do him a disservice, but like they signed a dude that was controversial to sign. And you give him that opportunity, like you've given the opportunity to a lot of guys at heavyweight, especially that could be marketable. The difference is Brock Lesnar was the UFC heavyweight champion, and he was a Division I college wrestling champion. And he didn't have asthma. That's a big deal too. But they gave Greg Hardy Volkov so quick when it was so clear that Volkov was going to pick him apart and that he was never going to be at risk for the big, first 30-second shot from Greg Hardy that could kill most human beings on earth. But it's like, if their goal was to make money off that guy, they really jump the gun. Sometimes I would have more confidence in them than this usually, but sometimes it seems like they just get too excited and they want to push someone to that level now when it's clear to everybody else that they weren't going to. And every time Greg Hardy would bounce back and get a win over, one of those guys that's barely hanging around the bottom of the UFC heavyweight division, they'd do it right again. They'd put him in a co-main event on a fight night against a guy that, when you handicap it and when you look at what they've done, because he's usually fighting a guy that's way better than him but kind of on a losing streak, it makes for interesting conversation. And can Greg Hardy put him away in round one before he gasses? But it just completely took away any of the I wonder what that guy could be. We saw that he was not going to get to that point. He never got the opportunity to.
I'm going to debate you a little bit on that one because I don't think Greg Hardy was done dirty. I think Greg Hardy was given gift after gift after gift, because you have to remember, you're mentioning the Volkov fight, which first of all materialized on short notice. That was not a planned move for Greg Hardy. They needed a fight. That fight card had mostly fallen apart with the exception of Calvin Kattar versus Magomed Sharapov. They were losing fight after fight after fight. And I can't remember who Volkov was supposed to fight on that fight card, but he was supposed to fight somebody far better. Maybe Junior Dos Santos. It might have been Junior Dos Santos, but that was still, after even given all of that, the seventh fight that Greg Hardy fought under the Zuffa promotion banner. That's the seventh fight he had under the Zuffa. That includes fights with guys like Juan Adams and Alan Crowder and Dmitry Smolyakov and Ben the Combat Wombat Sosoli. He got all of those guys first, and it was only when he took a short notice step up. He may have been even slower played, especially in the heavyweight division, even slower played than Paddy Pimblett. I actually debate the exact opposite. I think they played him super slow. And then after it showed that he did not have it in the Alexander Volkov fight, then he got Yorgan De Castro and Maurice Green, which means in his first 9 fights under the Zuffa banner, currently one of them is still hired by the UFC. Actually, no, I take that back. Austin Lane now, also now back with the UFC after failing on Contender Series and then succeeding on Contender Series. So 2 of those 9 guys are even in the UFC anymore. So 2 out of 9 guys are lasted even as long as he did in the UFC. He lasted longer than 7 of the first 9 guys he fought. I think he got played extremely slow because they were trying to make him some sort of success, which I don't know that he was ever going to be, both because of his physical and his mental limitations, because I think both of them played a pretty large factor.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a real problem when, one, you don't know the rules of the sport, and when your body has trained for your entire life to use very quick, explosive bursts of energy, and now you're in a sport where you have to make sure that you have enough in the tank for a grueling final 5 minutes when you might be in the most pain that you've been in all night. But here's the thing about those setup fights for Hardy. So 2 Contender Series fights against Austin Lane and Tavares Gordon. And then he loses to Alan Crowder technically because of the DQ.
He was going to get beat in that fight anyway, by the way. He was losing that fight. He got the DQ so that he could get out of it and save face. But yeah, to your point.
No, here's the thing. I'm not arguing that Greg Hardy was ever going to be a top 10 UFC heavyweight. A lot of guys can just crack the top 15 if they get into a big enough win in a big enough matchup. But it was from the Dmitry Smolyakov and the Juan Adams and Ben Sosoli, especially, with the way the Sosoli fight was overturned. Why even in a late replacement situation do you give a guy that you gotta think you have a lot invested in, you have high hopes for, to Alexander Volkov, a guy who is just at least it's not designed to be necessarily a boring fight, but he's going to look really, really bad. And he's going to look bad against a dude that, at the time, for sure, people knew was like at the gatekeeper stage of his career. And he made him look real bad.
I think it's probably because at a certain point in time with these prospects who you might not be all that high on or whatever. I think it's a certain point in time the UFC knows you need to either shit or get off the pot. And I think they had kind of entered that realm with Greg Hardy. He was beginning to look not that impressive against Ben Socially. And at that point, you're like, okay, well, he's going to be a big puncher or he's going to be nothing. So we might as well see what we can get out of him for the next couple of fights. And they ran him against Volkov, terribly boring fight, not competitive in any way. Then they ran 2 more fights with guys they knew he could beat. And we're like, again, he looked terrible. Sure, he beat Maurice Green, but how did he beat Maurice Green? And what way did he beat Maurice Green? So then they were like, well, let's see if he can knock out Tybura. Let's see if he can knock out Tuivasa. Let's see if he can knock out Spivak. And they were just trying. I think at a certain point in time, you just have to be like, they knew he was never going to be that thing. They knew they had to give it a whirl or it was never going to happen.
Well, I just think that the big fights that they did give him. All right. So Volkov and Tybura, those are 2 guys that are just tailor-made to out kickbox or just out, mixed martial arts fight a dude over the course of usually 3 rounds. And it looks pretty and it's very good, technique. But again, a dude like Greg Hardy will get picked apart by it. And then, you give him to Tuivasa. There, I will say, that is a test that if you're Greg Hardy, you're going to have to pass, even though it's going to be, that's a tough fight. And that's, a tough one to come out with on top because Ty is a freak and can take your big shots and he's throwing them back. And then like Sergey Spivak, it's like that was obviously, going to end in Greg Hardy on the ground in one way or another giving up.
But those are all different styles though that you mentioned though too. Like yeah. I don't think there was a good ceiling for this dude, right? Because Volkov doesn't want to be on the ground under any circumstances. Does he want to be on the ground? He wants to pick you apart from the outside. Tai Tuivasa wants to box you too, but he wants to be on the inside and box you. Then you got Marcin Tybura who wants to make it dirty against the cage and does want to wear you out and stuff like that. And if you want to go back to his loss with Alan Crowder, that's a completely different type of fighter too. That's a double leg, take you down, ground and pound you. And I have rudimentary kickboxing from the outside. Then you got Spivak, who's a guy who's looking for subs. They ran him with a bunch of different dudes to see maybe he can punch this guy. Maybe he can punch this guy. Maybe he can punch this guy. I think it was just a last ditch effort to extract some level of, just some level of value out of a guy who no longer had any value to them.
Okay. And then there's a couple other guys I want to get to too. But my last point on it, at least with Greg Hardy, is if that's what you're going to do, if it was only, test him against guys like Volkov and Tybura who, are great fighters, but they're not big draws. Greg Hardy could carry, a fight night just by being the co-main event. He was a draw on his own. It just seems like they missed a lot of opportunities there. If you're going to bring him up slowly and feed him what we consider to be mediocre competition, you would think it would be in the realm of the Josh Parisians, what's the other dude who kind of looks like Josh Parisian? Jared Vandera. Yeah.
But that's who won. Isn't that who Juan Adams was? I mean, to an extent, that's who Adam Crowder was. They did give him those guys.
Not at the right time, though. At the time where it was still being figured out whether Greg Hardy was a joke or not. In being in it, because before we had seen him, you just always have to assume that this isn't going to be for real until you see a guy actually at that level. I think imagine a fight with Chase Sherman or Augusto Sakai would have been, I think, right in that perfect range of not as good as Ty. He's gonna slug with him. It would play right well into their hand. I mean, at that point, you might as well put Greg Hardy against Andrei Arlovsky. That didn't do much. And then the other thing, if they were just gonna cash out on him, at a certain point when they're like, all right, this guy is not going to be like headlining big pay-per-views, on the other side of Francis Ngannou. Why not do like him versus Derek Lewis? Because there was already that thing where Derek Lewis had like not called him out, but basically threatened him. And so, my stepdad used to beat my mom too. So I'd love to get a shot at Greg Hardy. And it's like, well, now my life won't be complete unless I see Derek Lewis get that opportunity.
Well, I mean, they did it. They gave him Derek Lewis light. That's Tai Tuivasa. They gave him Derek Lewis, only a Derek Lewis who can't grapple. I mean, like, and to your point, like, I do think they gave him guys at the right time. I mentioned, Juan Adams and Alan Crowder, but like Maurice Green was a guy who I thought had some potential, but it turns out he had some grappling skills and pretty much nothing else. And he fought Tai Tuivasa in the same year, the same 12 months as he fought Maurice Green. He was released from the UFC only 18 months after he fought Maurice Green. So it's not like they weren't giving him what they considered to be cupcakes almost right up until the end, until they gave him that 3-piece right at the end where they were like, here are a couple of grapplers that we kind of hope you can punch out, and one guy who will stand and bang with you, and like tried to cash him out. But like, they kept him in fights that weren't cash out fights almost right up into the end.
Okay, here's where I think we can transition to another dude who I think got a real bad rap over the last year or two. What I can't change the way that you feel about the way that Greg Hardy was used in the UFC, and I don't like Greg Hardy. I was intrigued at what that skill set at that high of a level could be capable of potentially. I'd love to see it in a dude who doesn't need an inhaler in between rounds. But, I don't like him, but I do feel like I can't also ignore the fact that, like, whenever I saw him matched up in a fight, I was like, what is the point of that? Like, he's going to get out jabbed and probably taken down and, like, controlled from side control by Marcin Tybura. I'm not compelled by it. It was, I don't know, man. That's the other problem with coming into a different sport as a 32, 33-year-old prospect who, is already famous before he comes into the UFC and yet still kind of belongs at that high of a level. So I can't ignore the fact that, like, dude, for a guy who just played football his whole life, the fact that he won any UFC fights against any UFC fighters at all is incredible. That's just the Brock Lesnar effect lessened to a giant degree. But no, hey, Daniel, the Golden Boy, Edmund Shabazian, sitting at 12-3, sitting at 25 years old. He got into that fake, imaginary, hypothetical UFC middleweight Grand Prix to determine the title shots in the order of the rankings after he knocked out Brad Tavares all the way back in November of 2019 when he was like 22. Then he took 3 bad losses in a row from August of 2020 to November 2021, gets brutalized by Derek Brunson, gets tuned up by Jack Hermanson, gets finished ugly by Nasruddin Imavov. And people were talking about him like, Edmund sucks. The hate on him started so quick. And I think people often forget how young even a 25-year-old prospect is for the UFC, let alone for, shaking out in a potential title picture. And he lost to 3 really good fighters at middleweight. Derek Brunson, went on a great run. Hermanson has, had good wins and been competitive in the ones that he didn't get. And Imavov's been, one of the faster rising prospects, especially over the last few months of that whole class. And so on that UFC 282 card that also had Action Man versus Joaquin Buckley and Dricus du Plessis against Darren Till, I was really happy to see the 3 guys that did come out victorious in that. I thought it was like the most possible exciting shakeout for the UFC middleweight division, which is like looking so strong. Edmund getting back on the horse, and, getting a fun finish. And against Dolce, who, like, look, I don't know what Dolce is. He is a guy who has an EFC belt at heavyweight and light heavyweight. He's like 5'10". He's fighting at middleweight. And yet, like, the first moment I was encouraged, I was rooting for Edmund. He gets like pinned up against the cage by Dolce, and then he like muscles his way and reverses it around and pins Dolce. And I was like, all right, I think Edmund's going to be fine in this one. I was glad to see him, look good there, because this is a guy who's still so young that he really is belonging in this class of fighters. And I think that in this new situation that he's found, hopefully, especially for a younger dude, that is, it seems to have had a good effect. And if that continues, then yeah, like if they pair him up against Action Man, or if they, they won't, but if they pair him up with Duplessis, there's so many good middleweight fights to be made in that range of dudes right now. And, because Izzy cleaned out, the dudes that occupied the top 5. Now he's now he's certainly gonna, be fighting Pereira for, which is a whole other thing. Like, now it's just so weird to have like two guys in the same year, in Izzy and Kamaru, who are just used to being just these like GSP Anderson Silva dominant fixture types. And it's not like they retired or had a gruesome injury. It's like someone better came along and beat them, which was awesome for middleweight. For a title fight challenger to command serious consideration, and, to think that a guy actually has a chance is very important, because we really started to get bored there at the end of the run of GSP and Anderson Silva. And, John Jones, luckily he got a little more variety and there was a little more flair thrown in the middle of that. But, we're seeing more of those dominant champions take losses in weight classes like this, especially when guys like Edmund Shabazian and Dreykus, Brendan Allen, now on a 3-fight winning streak, all in 2022. That is a weight class just full of Cal Borello, still forgetting about him, and he's currently ranked ahead of Edmund. I think there's a lot of potential there with Edmund, and I think that was a dude that fans were way too quick to be completely done with when a dude is still that young.
Absolutely. Now unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut you short in just 2 seconds, because I've got a fighter waiting for me in about 5 minutes, but I am going to give you my thoughts on Edmund Shabazian real quick. So to your point, I think people were maybe a little bit quick to write him off, but I would also say here's the problem with why I actually almost felt okay writing him off when he did. He was a guy who was training in a place where we largely considered to not be that well-rounded. A lot of things have been said about Glendale Fight Club and Edmund Tavarian and things like that have led us to believe that maybe perhaps they're not running the best ship down there to complete like well-rounded martial artists. So Edmund Shabazian's problem was that in all 3 of those fights, and granted, you're right, huge step up in competition. Although, I don't know, maybe from Brad Tavares to Jack Hermanson or Brad Tavares to Nassourdine Imavov, it's not that big of a step. But in all 3 of those fights, he had the same problem. He had the same problem in that he either got taken down like he did with Brunson or Hermanson, or with Imavov, got pushed up against the cage and just like didn't have an answer, didn't have the way to turn out of it. And to see somebody lose 3 times in a row to some of the same shit makes you feel like, well, what the hell was his coach doing in the meantime? Because if you lose to Derek Brunson due to his wrestling and then you get Jack Hermanson next, like, guess what Jack Hermanson's doing, dude? Like, and it felt like he went in shocked that Jack Hermanson was going to take him down. And so, like, to your point, when Dulcer put him up against the cage, I was like, man, maybe he hasn't learned anything at Extreme Couture. Maybe he was not fixable. And then he used a very technical way of getting out of that situation, put the pressure on himself, not to mention he looks much bigger and much stronger. So I think the move was huge for him. I think if he didn't make the move, I don't think we were too soon at writing him off, because at the end of the day, I think if he stayed there, I think he would have had a tough time with Dolce Lugiambula at the end of the day. I think Dolce champion there possibly gives Glendale Fight Club's Edmund Shabazian a tough time.
All right, folks. That was a lot. I feel like we covered the year of 2022 and projected forward to what this year is going to be like. Folks, thank you so much to Daniel Gumby Vreeland for joining me today. Go listen to the MMA Gambling Podcast on the Sports Gambling Podcast Network. It's a great show. Gumby, thanks so much for being here, man. This is a lot of fun.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, folks. This has been another interlude episode of RotoBallers official MMA podcast. Tap that. I'm going to try to have as many guests on as possible in the coming months. Got away from interlude episodes for a little bit, but these have been a blast. The UFC back on January 14th. I'm making boxing picks at the very least. There's other MMA cards. Folks, have yourselves a great week. Start off 2023 right. Thanks for listening. Peace.